Hello, my name's Bob Keeley. I've lived in Church Street all my life, virtually in the same house where I live in now, and I thought today we could just take a walk up and down the street, and I'll sort of try and give you one or two reminiscences of the people who lived here and how it's changed and what the house has been, etc. so on. I think the time slot is probably about the 1940s, 1950s. So we've got sort of that time frame if you can sort of visualise what it looked like in those days. When I was a child, 80, 81, 82, 83 years ago, it was a metal road, as were quite a lot of roads in Devonport at the time, I think, you know. And with the council depot halfway down it, my grandparents and everybody used to call it Dirt Street because the council in those days, nothing ever seemed to get done to Church Street. It was always this rough, dirty, dusty metal road connecting Albert Road and Vauxhall Road in the other end of it. So it was granted, and of course it was a very, very poor street. You know, there wasn't much affluence in Church Street in those days. It was all working class, and we'd just come out of the Depression, of course, and there were a lot of people who were really hard up against it, you know, which we knew. But all good people, and they were great days, yes, yeah. Originally, it was belonged to Mr. and Mrs. Wright. Mr. Wright was a great bowler and friend of my grandfather's, and they would make daily pilgrimages to the Devonport Bowling Club, I think, to partake of anything that was going on the top shelf. He was J.P. Wright, and the Wright family, when J.P. died, the Wright family came out. There was Mrs. Wright and her family, and there's Mary Wright, who still is going strong around Devonport. They lived there for many years. In fact, they lived there, they were in this house until the present owners took over and did a refurbishment on it, which is, it's rather nice. In fact, it never looks quite so good. Number 62 here, this was the Micklejohns, and this is the family home at the back, as we can see, but over here on the left, there's the remnants of a brick wall, which was part of the northern bag wash, which in those days you put all your washing into a bag and they came, took it away and washed it here. So we had the bag wash here. It always seemed a large building to me, but looking at it here, it couldn't have been that large. But there were quite a few people employed, and there was a boiler house here, where this house is here. And the Micklejohns, they operated that all for quite a long time, with smoke belching out and all those things. I went to school with some of the younger generation of the Micklejohns, with Dervin and all the gang. They were highly respected individuals, and they were nice people. Yeah, it was good, and so perhaps their nefarious sort of bag wash operation was overlooked by the locals. The garage and the new little house here, of course, are new additions to it. Number 60, Mr. and Mrs. Patel, Ranji Dupal Patel. He was obviously an Indian gentleman, and he used to run a vegetable business. He had an old Model A van, and he would trundle around, and they both lived here, but over here to the thing further down was a large shed which he had his operation in. And like a lot of things in those days, there would be these sort of itinerants, that's not the word, but these folk who would go round. You know, there was the vegetable man, the baker, the fish man and stuff like that, who sort of moved round the roads with their vans and their things and sold door to door, yes. So Mr. Patel, he was a little short man, quite dark and very polite, and he and Mrs. Patel lived there. It was subsequently sold, and sort of went through a whole lot of various owners. It was subdivided up, and the next property down the road, where the Alexanders built a house at the back, that became part of it. So it was sold up and divided quite early on in the piece. Number 48, they've been our neighbours for, or I should say 80 years. Heather lives there now, and her mother and father lived there, and her grandparents lived there before her. The grandparents were Mr. and Mrs. Symes. They were a real doughty Scotch couple, and then Bessie and Alf Calder came, the daughter and son-in-law came to live there with Heather as a young person. Bessie, who died at 103, I think, relatively recently, used to wheel me round in a pushchair. And recently, the original old cottage of which Mrs. Calder lived in had run its use-by date, and Heather rebuilt. She was compelled to rebuild in the style that you see, which is relatively harmonious, you know. But well, when I was young, and again we're probably going back 80 years, the Evans family had it. There was Dave and Henrietta and the three children, Alan, Nairi and Peter. And Dave worked. He'd been in the timber, you know, felling trees and things, and he worked in Aikens, the timber yard over in Auckland. And again, I keep going back, but Depression days, you know, the family were, well, they weren't poverty-stricken, but things weren't certainly weren't affluent. And the story goes, which I think is true, that the banks were going to close on them. And to stop the bank closure, they needed £25, which is $50. And my grandfather lent them that, and they were able to stay there. And they were a great family. They'd lived there all their lives, and then they both, of course, passed away, and so they moved on. And recently it's been given an update, which is quite, you know, pretty nice. It looks very nice at the moment, I must say. And but again, you have this sort of, these days in Devonport, this transient population. Number 44, well, originally, again, going back, the Caldwells lived there, family with 2 children. They lived there for quite a while. Then, of course, it changed hands, and I remember it when Mr. and Mrs. Williams had it. She taught ballet, and Mr. Williams used to keep the hedge cut immaculately, and then they moved on, and I think their children had it for a while, and I'm not sure who's got it now. Next door, the Brown building, of course, that now is on the site of the old Presbyterian church, which of course is the museum building. The place next door, that belonged to Mr. and Mrs. Burbish, who were friends of my grandparents. But when I was a kid, the Hassells. Mr. Hassel was a bus driver, and there was a large family who all went to Devonport School. Dennis was my friend, and they lived there for many, many years until they moved on. I only remember it as being lived in by Charlie Burrows. Charlie Burrows, I always called him the Burrows Shepherd. On the Mount Victoria, it was fenced off right round with a 5-wire fence, and it used to have a flock of sheep on it. So consequently, Mount Victoria, when I was a kid, was like a lawn, you know, before the Kikuyu got in. And Charlie Burrows looked after the sheep. It subsequently had cattle on it, but that was after his time. So this was Charlie Burrows' place. 36 was originally belonged to Timewells. The name of the house, I think, is Milton House. They came from Milton Abbas, I think, in England. And they were an old family. They'd lived here for some time. The daughters were schoolmates of my mother's, so that's going back quite a long time. And then of course it changed hands, and I remember it belonged to the Haysons. They were a big family. Bert Hayson, he ran the local taxi service. It was sort of a bit of a legend around Devonport. A big family, like so many houses in Devonport, it sort of fell on sad, harder times, you know, but it's been really nicely restored. So it's nice to see the old place here. The one immediately in front of us here, behind the hedge, that was bought in. It used to be a couple of units, but prior to that it was either the tennis court or the garden for Milton House. Yes.
Number 34, Wisteria Cottage.
That used to be the home of the Graves, Mr. and Mrs. Graves, and Bubbles, who was the daughter. I don't know what her real name was, but we've always called her Bubbles. She attended Devonport School with me. It's a very old building. It's probably one of the older ones in the street. Ma and Pa wouldn't sort of have ever won any beauty contests, although they were nice enough folk. But Bubbles was drop dead gorgeous. I remember we all thought she was absolutely wonderful. Wouldn't be able to say that now, but she was sort of the belle of the class. I think I've got a picture of her somewhere in Devonport School here. Well, I'm not quite sure whether I remember. It was two shops, and on the parapet, or whatever you like to call it, at the top, there used to be a sign which read E. Bluck, late of Garlick and Cranwell. Garlick and Cranwell were, I think, big merchants in Auckland. I'm not sure, but I think they were. And I've always sort of got a feeling that it was either a hardware shop or a general merchant or something, but I think next door I think it was a dairy. I can never vividly remember it as sort of an active trading post. It lay empty, I think, like a lot of buildings again after the Depression. It originally, I think, had a veranda stuck out in the front of it, which would give thing, and as you can see, you know, it was patently two shops, yes, because next door to it, of course, was the butcher's shop. When I worked for the council in my later working years, we had this Copper Beech sapling, or whatever you like to call it, in the nursery, and didn't know where to put it. And Brett Garrier was the Parks and Foreman then, and he said, why don't you stick it down the bottom of your street, sort of as a memorial to you. So the thing was that I planted it, and it's probably no more than 20 odd years old, that tree, and it's phenomenal growth, because I think normally copper beeches take a hell of a long time to go. It's a beautiful tree. It and the magnolia we planted up, and the Polonia on the little reserve, which is, as you know, is on the site of the old butcher's shop, Hillaby's butcher's shop. And when that ceased trading as a butcher's shop, the Titchener family took it over and produced preserves and jam. So it was Titchener's jam factory, and it operated like that for quite some time. There was always a little bit of reserve here on the left where this magnolia tree is on the apex. But obviously perhaps the Devonport Borough Council must have purchased the land and turned it into the little reserve it is. Well, that was the Midway Cash Groceries or store. Bob Worthington had it. It was a wonderful, a real grocer's shop, and Bob himself, they were English, and he had a broad accent, but the shop was always immaculate, and he wore every day a starched white apron, and he was spotless, and he had a real sort of cockneyish sort of sense of humour, when you could understand him, and Mrs. Worthington was of sombre appearance, who hovered in the background. But in those days, my mother, you'd ring up Bob Worthington with a list, and you know, a small time later, round he would come with all your groceries and stuff. And to be repeated about 80 years later by New World, who now have a delivery service. So nothing's new. Yes, Bob Worthington, yes. He subsequently actually sold that business, or it closed down for some reason or other, and he re-established himself down where Platters are. He had a store down there for quite some time.